Previously, on Catastrophic Failure.
We were all depressed because it was kind of like the closing of the door and he's going to get community service.
Nauman Hussain pleaded guilty to 20 counts of criminally negligent homicide, but would serve no prison time.
Nothing about it felt right at all.
The plea deal seemed like a slap on the wrist compared to the enormity of the tragedy. People had questions. One in particular rose to the top, and then started bubbling over. Was the FBI protecting Nauman Hussain somehow? Perhaps because of his father's work as an informant?
I am requesting your commitment today to turn over all the FBI's documents, including the source file related to Mr. Hussain, his family, his companies, and any involvement in the investigation.
Congresswoman Elise Stefanik forced the FBI to release information about the nature of their relationship with Shaheed Hussain. The agency would not say much, but they swore they were not protecting Nauman and that they had nothing to do with anything that led to the limo crash. By 2022, nearly 4 years after the crash, it seemed like this tragic case was coming to an end, at least in terms of any criminal justice. The civil cases against the Hussains and Mavis Discount Tire were still a chance for justice for the Limo families. But then, in August of 2022, there was a shocking turn of events that changed everything. I'm Jessica Marshall. This is Catastrophic Failure, Episode 8. Expect the Unexpected. If you've been with us thus far, you know that the narrative and the details may be upsetting or disturbing at times, so please listen with care. In the last episode of this podcast, we talked a lot about Shaheed Hussain. He's the owner of Prestige Limousine and Chauffeur Service, and he's Nauman Hussain's father. We heard directly from him, finally, after 6 years of trying to find him. He reached out to us to say, among other things, that he believes that he and his son have been unfairly blamed for the limo crash. But we've never heard from Nauman Hussain. According to his defense attorney, he has been instructed not to speak to the media. We knew very little about his life when he took that plea deal that spared him prison time. He was 30 years old at the time, in 2021. He was living with his brother and his girlfriend, who would eventually become his fiancée.
I had always heard he was the most polite kid.
Reporter Larry Rulison saw Nauman Hussain a lot in the years after the crash. He observed him closely in court.
In my mind, and when I saw, he always seemed very subservient to his older brother. And I'd heard that the brothers were very subservient to the dad. But Nauman was always so soft-spoken. I could hear him talk in court and other settings, but it was always very low voice. But he was always very polite.
From his father's testimony in court a decade earlier as an FBI informant, we knew that Nauman was born in Pakistan. He came with his parents and older brother to the United States in the mid-1990s. He went to public school in a suburb of Albany. His mother died in 2013 when he was in his early 20s of complications from liver disease. His father traveled a lot, for work, he claimed. As an adult, Nauman played on a competitive paintball team, and by all accounts was quite good at it.
Yeah, I don't know what his goals in life were and all that, besides being a semi-professional paintball player and driving around nice cars. I don't know how much the limo business was like his passion in life. I think it was sort of forced upon him by his dad, and it was probably the only way he made any money to like pay his bills, besides the family's motel.
Nauman was as much of an enigma as his father. We really didn't know who he was or how he really felt about the limo crash. And in August of 2022, on the verge of formally being sentenced to probation and community service, it looked like we would never really know him. And if you don't mind, just to start out so I can get some levels, can you just say your name and your title?
My name is Lee Kinlan, and I am one of the attorneys for Nauman Hussain.
Lee Kinlan is tall, bald as a cue ball, always dressed smartly in a full suit. He's friendly and approachable, but he looks you right in the eye. He also has some hard edges. He can get pretty heated if you push him. He's good at his job, though, and you can sense that he cares deeply about his clients, Nauman included.
They're good people. I mean, they're guys I enjoy talking to as clients.
Kinlan takes on tough cases, ones that don't always end in acquittals. His clients are accused of everything from DWI to murder. He's also a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve. He worked as a judge advocate in the Marines. He served a tour of duty in Iraq, stationed in Fallujah. You don't have to be in his presence long to sense he's really seen some stuff. Unimaginable things, at least to the average person. So taking on Nauman Hussain's case, one that involved the horrific deaths of 20 people, it wasn't so far outside of the norm for Lee Kinlan.
I've done more murder cases than I can remember. I've been in a war. I spent 7 months, walking around the streets of Fallujah and dealing with, the aftermath of what happens when a war comes to a civilian population. What the families have gone through, to me, is just incomprehensible. The loss of 4 daughters, and just as a human being, it's tough for me to wrap my head around those things. But I also understand that this job, there's a clinical approach I need to take to this, and that is, I have a client, I need to defend that client, and I need to do it well.
Kinlan was expecting a short and perfunctory proceeding that day in August of 2022. It had been almost exactly a year since the plea deal that he helped arrange went through. They were just there to receive the formal sentencing, community service, probation, not prison. But for all of his experience, 20 years of it at that, Lee Kinlan fully admits that he did not see what was coming before he stepped into the small Schoharie courtroom that morning. Schoharie County District Attorney Susan Mallory told Larry Rulison a few weeks before this hearing that she'd expected the judge would go ahead with the plea agreement and 4 years of probation, but she was careful to add that she didn't want to speculate. I personally was not in the courtroom that day, so I can only go on what Larry and others have told me about what happened and what I could discern on the pool feed that news outlets were allowed to share. Something felt different in that courtroom that day. Something was different. For one, Schoharie County Court Judge George Bartlett III was not there. That's the judge who approved the plea deal, and who was so seemingly torn about it that he cried on the bench. He had turned 70, the mandatory retirement age for most judges in New York State. He stepped down from the bench. Replacing him was State Supreme Court Justice Peter Lynch. Now, New York has a very complicated judicial system. For clarity's sake, when we say Supreme Court Justice in New York, we're not talking about a member of the state's highest appellate court, like in other states and the federal Supreme Court. A Supreme Court Justice, like Peter Lynch, is just a high-level judge who can hear any cases, criminal or civil. The decision to give a Supreme Court Justice a case like Nauman Hussain's in New York usually comes from the state's court administration. Judge Peter Lynch is from Albany. He comes from a powerful family. They've all but dominated the legal scene there for generations. Lynch's twin brother is also a state Supreme Court justice, and so is his nephew. Lynch is an imposing figure. Journalist Ben Ryder Howe described him as, quote, lantern-jawed in his New York Magazine article. It's a fair descriptor. Lynch does have a strong jaw. That, plus his ruddy complexion, makes him look almost as if he's made of stone. He has a shock of white hair, neatly parted and combed back, not a hair out of place. He gives off a vibe that says he takes exactly zero BS. If he's convivial off the bench, you'd never guess it. Lynch was all business in that Schoharie courtroom. Lee Kindlin was no stranger to Judge Peter Lynch.
I've been practicing in front of Judge Lynch for a decade.
Again, it's worth mentioning, the region of upstate New York around Albany is a very small world when it comes to the legal community. Everyone knows each other. Almost too well.
I could see a glint in his eye as people are talking. And just something in the lizard part of my brain said, hey, Lee, something's about to happen.
If Susan Mallory felt that too, she did not let on. Like Lynch, she appeared to be all business in that courtroom. She kept her head down mostly. She appeared to be taking a lot of notes. As soon as Judge Lynch called order and started to speak, the Limo families who came to the hearing started to feel a shift. Sam Bersesi and his wife Jerry, who lost their daughter Savannah in the crash, sat right up front, like they'd always done at every prior court proceeding.
I knew something was going weird with Lynch.
The way he
Peter.
was talking.
Just the way he was talking was like, okay,
We were all
this
doing
is
like
not
this,
normal.
Donna Rivenberg, who lost her daughter Amanda, was in the second row. She was sitting with a friend.
And it started to take a turn. I'm looking at her going, this doesn't, shh. I'm like, I want to say something.
Kindlin kept his face calm, but his mind was reeling.
That little voice started to get louder saying, Lee, this thing is about to go sideways. And then that's when I leaned over to Chad, co-counsel, and I leaned over to Nauman. And I'm like, something weird's about to happen. Just stand by.
Nauman was wearing a face mask, a holdover from the pandemic, so you couldn't quite make out his full expression. But his eyes got very wide, and he started to look nervous.
I would like to talk about the nature of the plea agreement.
And then the judge dropped a bomb.
I am not going to abide by the plea agreement.
Judge Peter Lynch threw out Nauman Hussain's guilty plea and the agreement that was made to spare him prison time.
Oh my God. There was a day when I thought I was going to jump out of my skin in disbelief.
That's Jill Richardson Perez, who lost her son, Matthew.
I'm like, did I hear that? Did I really? And we just looked at each other, every single one of us as parents just looked at each other like, oh my God, can he do that?
Kevin Cushing was there too. He lost his son, Patrick.
I mean, it sucked the air out of the room because we couldn't believe it. I mean, we all inhaled.
That moment that Peter Lynch did that,
Oh God, that was amazing.
we were shocked.
And when he said, I refuse to sign this, we all like screamed. And we were like just dumbfounded.
It also shocked Larry Rulison. He had never seen anything like that happen in a courtroom. How rare is what just happened? A plea deal being overturned, like a plea deal of that magnitude being overturned. Is that a rare thing?
Totally. And especially in the way it was done. You know, Lynch didn't tell anyone in advance what he was going to do. In fact, I remember the only time Susan Mallory ever called me back during the whole trial was when Judge Lynch got appointed, and she made a point of saying, I have no idea what he's going to do.
Nauman Hussain had two choices. If he kept his guilty plea of criminally negligent homicide, he'd be sentenced to 1 1/3 to 4 years in prison, and he likely would have been handcuffed on the spot and escorted to jail. But he could also choose to go to trial for both criminally negligent homicide and second-degree manslaughter. That's the higher charge that he was facing before the plea deal. That carries a much heftier sentence, 5 to 15 years. Of course, there was also the chance that a jury would find him not guilty at trial, and he'd be free of this whole thing forever. To say it was a tough choice would be vastly understating it. And he did not get much time to decide. Judge Lynch laid out his reasons for rejecting the plea deal, which we will get into in a moment, but he sent them all, Nauman Hussain, his lawyers, and Susan Mallory, into a room together, and he called a recess. You have 15 minutes to decide what to do, he told them. Prison now or trial?
It was a very frustrating hour of my life.
We'll be right back.
Why is healthcare so expensive? What's happening with climate change? And are elections safe? You can find answers to those questions and a lot more with Capitol Confidential from me, Dan Clark. I give you the latest news and analysis from the state capitol and beyond. Sign up now at CapitolConfidential.com. That's Capital with an O, confidential.com.
This is catastrophic failure. As we mentioned before the break, Judge Peter Lynch laid out his reasons for rejecting the plea deal. Remember back in episode 3, we talked about how the doomed limousine had been ordered off the road 3 times? 2 of those times, New York State Department of Transportation investigator Chad Smith had slapped an out-of-service sticker on the windshield. It's standard protocol. If your vehicle does not meet DOT safety standards, it gets that sticker. It's a large white sticker about the size of a typical piece of printer paper. Out of service is written in large, bold red lettering. The sticker's hard to remove, and it's not meant to be removed. unless the owner of the vehicle completes the necessary repairs ordered by the DOT. When Nauman Hussain was arrested in 2018, just after the crash, state troopers had pulled him over as he was driving on an interstate. In the back of his car, they found 2 of these stickers. They were both torn and crumpled up. Investigators took them as evidence. Turns out, they were the same stickers that Chad Smith had slapped on the limo months earlier. They had one of them tested for DNA, and Nauman's DNA was all over it. This was the match in the powder keg for Judge Lynch. It's what drove him, he says, to reverse the plea deal.
One consciously removes a sticker from a vehicle that was placed on the vehicle by the authorities that it was out of service, that action is consistent with being aware of and consciously disregarding the risk.
As in, it was proof that Nauman Hussain knew that he was putting a dangerous vehicle on the road. The difference between manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide is knowing that you're doing something that puts others at risk.
The whole problem had always been why the plea deal had been for the criminally negligent homicide when basically state police investigators had proved that Nauman Hussain had ripped off this sticker that had barred him from using the limo after a failed inspection, because they wanted to show that he knew he wasn't supposed to be renting that limo out to customers, and that he knew by doing that was a criminal act. So Judge Lynch basically said, based on the evidence that was presented in this case to date, that this plea deal just doesn't make any legal sense.
After almost exactly 15 minutes, Judge Lynch called everyone to return to the courtroom. It was time to hear Nauman's decision. Would he keep his plea and walk out of the courtroom in handcuffs? Or would he choose a trial?
Everyone looks upset. Mm-hmm. And we're like, okay, what's going on?
They come from that back room, all just ashen, but they said they would enter not guilty plea and go to trial.
Nauman was now going to stand trial on 20 counts of criminally negligent homicide and 20 counts of second-degree manslaughter. It was a big gamble. Nauman Hussain was visibly shaken. He looked scared. Lee Kindlon looked rattled. Judge Lynch glared down from the bench, confident in the rule of law. But what about Susan Mallory? From his perch in the front row, Sam Bersesi says he trained his eyes on her, studying her reaction.
Because Susan was upset also. Right. So we're like, why are they both upset? Why wouldn't she be happy and they be upset?
Right.
And now we know why she's not happy. Because now she has to, as she always told us, Susan always says this, I'm always preparing for trial. Even though we're working on a plea, my end goal is I'm going to have to try this case. We're always preparing. And now all of a sudden, we're not ready for trial. It should be an easy transition from plea deal to trial. But she's visibly upset about this whole thing.
She didn't think it would go this far. She did not want that plea deal to be rejected at all. I mean, she'd worked a long time for that, and her office couldn't handle the trial. So she was just as upset. I think she was speechless, if I remember.
It's worth pointing out here that before the plea deal in 2021, New York State Attorney General Tish James's office offered Susan Mallory help. The most powerful prosecutor in the state was going to dedicate lawyers and resources to Schoharie County's tiny office to help bring the case to trial. But Mallory turned it down and went with the plea deal instead.
I mean, it was going to be very hard for her to bring this case to trial. It's a small office and an almost impossible task bringing this case to trial.
I'm not a lawyer. I did play with the idea of going to law school a few times, but that's as close as I got. So I don't have the first clue about the effort of bringing a case to trial. But the enormity of the limo crash and all the tentacles of evidence that have grown out of it, I think it's fair to guess that it would be nothing less than a behemoth for any prosecutor. Susan Mallory left the courthouse without a word. Nauman Hussain left with his girlfriend and brother and flanked by their bodyguards. Their heads were down, they were silent. The media followed, shouting questions at them, but they got into a Mercedes sedan and drove away from the courthouse, without acknowledging them. After nearly 4 years, the Limo families finally started to feel like justice was within reach. They were going to get their trial, after all.
And we're just ecstatic. It's been 4 years. And finally somebody has done the right thing.
Right.
It took just one person, Judge Lynch, to come in and say, hey, listen, this isn't right what's going on here. And he righted it.
I leaned over to one of the moms, and I leaned over and I said, I could just hug him. And she said, I could just kiss him. He went above and beyond, and that's a man that knows justice. And I was so glad he wasn't going to settle for that ridiculousness. That was beautiful.
When Lee Kindlin looks back on it, he says it's hard not to wonder if there was a way it could have gone differently.
So like I have regrets, maybe you should have taken that deal. On the other hand, I can't dwell, right? So it'll just drive you crazy.
Going back to that question that I asked you earlier about how hard it was to write the story about the initial plea deal going through, where was your head at when you were writing this one?
It was the classic unexpected result news story. And then it just breathed new life into this whole case that sort of just been plodding along as part of COVID. And then the plea deal was just seemed like everyone was going to forget it. And then all of a sudden it was back on alive and going forward. And there just seemed to be a lot to cover. It was exhilarating in a lot of ways.
The trial was originally scheduled for December of 2022, but Schoharie County DA Susan Mallory asked for more time to prepare. So Judge Lynch gave her a deadline, May of 2023. In that 9-month period between the reversal and the trial, Nauman Hussain's attorneys made an attempt to overturn Judge Lynch's ruling. It failed. They're going to trial. It's happening. May 1st. The judge is not delaying any longer. What are the big questions on your mind? What do you want to hear? What questions of yours do you want answered?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, my number one question was, are we going to hear from Nauman? Is Nauman going to testify? Would Shahid Hussain, his dad, would he come to the trial or not? How much about his involvement, the FBI's involvement, would that come out at trial? More details about the crash, and a lot of unanswered questions had gone on before that seemed to be sealed up by the plea deal. So this was, I think, the greatest opportunity. I was really thought it was really important to find out as much as we could, because this was our only chance.
Next time on Catastrophic Failure, the trial of Nauman Hussain begins.
And there were just so many people. It seemed like everyone in Schoharie was there.
The evidence will show that Mr. Hussain's choices led directly to and caused the deaths of those 20 people. on October 6, 2018.
Pretending that a single individual caused the death of so many is not justice.
Catastrophic Failure is a production of the Times-Union. It's produced and edited by myself, Jessica Marshall. Original reporting by Larry Rulison. Editorial direction and fact-checking by Erica Smith and Casey Seiler. Our theme music is Undercurrent by Harper Ray. If you have any questions or comments about anything in this podcast, or you're a player in the story who wants to talk to us for it, please email us at podcast@timesunion.com. That's podcast@timesunion.com.